The sun never rose in Sparta. It was always there, high and merciless. Sparta was not a city of marble temples or democratic assemblies. It was a military camp built upon an idea: discipline. From the moment of birth, every child was judged. The weak were cast out. The strong were owned by the state. At 7 years old, a boy was taken from his mother and began the agoge. This was not education. It was breaking and reshaping. They were taught to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint. They walked without sandals and slept without blankets. In the agoge, the most important lesson was not how to kill, but how to obey. The law of Sparta was simple: do not retreat, never surrender. The shield is everything. A Spartan warrior either came home with his shield on it. Among these boys was Leonidas, not the strongest, but the most determined. He was a rock against which the waves of the agoge broke. His eyes held the fire of a king, even when he was just a boy. As he grew, the shadow of a great war fell over the Greek world. To the east, the Persian Empire, ruled by King Xerxes I, had gathered an army so vast it was said to drink rivers dry. Xerxes demanded earth and water, the symbols of surrender, from all Greek city-states. Most trembled and complied. But not Sparta. When the Persian messenger came to Sparta to make the demand, Leonidas, now a respected leader and future king, was present. Leonidas, without changing the emotion in his face, gave the order. A king of Sparta needs no messenger to speak to him. He needs no gift. The Spartans seized the messenger and his interpreter, and they threw them into a deep well. "Tell Xerxes," Leonidas stated, "that he can find all the earth and water he needs at the bottom of the well." The war had begun, not with a treaty, but with an open declaration of defiance. The whole Greek world held its breath. The fate of freedom was about to be decided by a city that valued a single word above all others: law.
While the Spartans were training, Xerxes was preparing the greatest army ever assembled. His father, Darius, had failed 10 years earlier at Marathon. Xerxes would not fail. His ambition was not just conquest, it was to tame nature itself. He ordered a massive bridge to be built across the Hellespont Strait to move his army from Asia to Europe. This was a monumental task, and the first attempt failed miserably, swept away by a storm. In a fit of rage, Xerxes commanded his men to whip the sea 300 times and throw shackles into the water, declaring, "You hostile water, your master punishes you." A second, stronger bridge was built, made of thousands of ships chained together, forming a floating road over 7 kilometers long. It took 7 days and 7 nights for the endless army to cross. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of infantry, 10,000 immortals, the king's elite guard, thousands of cavalry, and a massive fleet of 1,200 warships. The Persian army was a mosaic of the conquered world: Medes, Assyrians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, all serving the will of one man. Their armor gleamed under the sun. They carried short spears, bows, and wicker shields. They relied on their sheer number. Xerxes himself sat on a golden throne atop a mountain overlooking his vast camp, watching his men. He was the most powerful man on earth, certain of victory. His generals only spoke of how quickly they would crush the small, divided Greek states. When the news of the Spartan execution of his messenger reached him, Xerxes merely laughed. "They are mad," he declared to his generals. "Mad, but their land will soon be mine. Their tiny city will become a footnote in the history of my empire." His route was planned. The Persian army would march along the coast towards central Greece. There was only one narrow point that could hold up such a large force: the Hot Gates, or as the Greeks called it, Thermopylae, a choke point between the mountains and the sea.
In the city of Delphi, nestled high in the mountains, stood the Temple of Apollo, the holiest place in the Greek world. Here, the oracle, a priestess known as the Pythia, spoke the will of the gods. The desperate Greek state sent envoys to seek guidance on how to survive the coming Persian invasion. The first prophecy given to the Athenians was terrifying. Fly, flee, and seek protection behind a wooden wall, otherwise all will be lost. The Athenian leaders debated, did wooden wall mean the ancient wooden palisade around the Acropolis, or the wooden ships of their navy? Then came the Spartan delegation. They stood before the Pythia, their faces grim, knowing that if any city was the target of Xerxes' wrath, it was theirs. The oracle delivered the prophecy to the Spartans. Hear your fate, you men of wide-wayed Sparta. Either your glorious, much-loved city shall be utterly wasted by the men of Perseus, or else the land of Lacedaemon shall mourn a king of Heracles' line. The strength of bulls and lions will not save her, for with him a man will be lost, but he will save Greece. The message was clear and chilling. Sparta would fall, or a king must die. Leonidas, a descendant of the hero Heracles, heard the prophecy. He did not flinch. He understood his destiny. For the Spartan king, the duty was not to live, but to protect the laws and honor of the city. He returned to Sparta and summoned the Council of Elders, the Gerousia. It was the time of the Carnea festival, a sacred period during which the Spartan army was forbidden from marching to war. Breaking this law meant angering the gods. The debate was fierce. Some argued they must wait until the festival was over and then send the full army, the thousands of hoplites. Others, remembering the prophecy, argued that Greece could not wait. Leonidas made a decision that would change history. He declared that he would take only a small force, 300 hand-picked Spartans, to hold the pass. This small force was technically not the army, thus respecting the law of the Carnea. The 300 Spartans he chose were not just warriors, they were fathers. They had all sired sons who would carry on their lineage, ensuring that the legacy of their families would continue even if they perished. Leonidas was going to his death, and he knew it. He went home and told his wife, Queen Gorgo, "I am going to war, my queen. I go to secure the future of our city." Gorgo, a true Spartan woman, simply replied, "Then bring your shield back or be brought back on it."
Leonidas and his 300 Spartans began their march north. They were not alone. As they traveled, allies from other Greek cities joined them, inspired by the Spartans' determination to fight. 700 brave Thespians, who swore to fight to the last man. 400 Thebans, whose loyalty was questioned, but who were brought along as a forced commitment. Hundreds of men from Phocis, Locris, and Corinth. In total, Leonidas had gathered a force of about 7,000 men. A small force, a speck of dust against the Persian Goliath, but united under a shared purpose, defending freedom. Their destination was the narrow coastal pass known as Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. The name came from the hot sulfur springs in the area. Thermopylae was the perfect place for a defense. On one side was the sheer, impassable Calidromo mountain range. On the other side
was the Malian Gulf. The pass itself was so narrow that only a few men could stand shoulder to shoulder, completely negating the Persians' massive numerical advantage. Upon arriving, Leonidas immediately ordered the Phocian contingent to repair an old stone wall that had been built across the narrowest point. This wall would serve as their primary defensive position. Leonidas was not a reckless warrior, he was a meticulous tactician. He knew that the only way to defeat the Persian army was through discipline, terrain, and the hoplite phalanx formation. The phalanx, a wall of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each protected by his neighbor's shield, forming an impenetrable barrier of bronze and wood. Their long spears, doru, would be the hedge of death. While preparing the defense, Leonidas sent scouts to observe the advance of the Persian army. The scouts returned with horrifying reports. The scale was even larger than rumored. A local Greek, a man from Thracias, tried to dissuade Leonidas. "King," he said, "when the Persians shoot their arrows, they are so many that they will blot out the sun." Leonidas's quiet response became legendary. "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." The 7,000 Greeks waited. Leonidas knew they could hold the pass for days, maybe a week. But the real question was, how long would the mountain hold?
4 days passed as the Greeks waited behind the stone wall. On the 5th day, the Persian scouting party appeared. They were cavalry, and they were stunned to find a serious army blocking the pass. News was rushed back to Xerxes. The king was initially furious, believing the reports of the small Greek force to be insults to his might. He waited, certain that the Greeks would flee out of fear upon seeing his full army. Xerxes waited for another 4 days. He sent a single horseman to observe the Greek camp. The messenger reported a strange and astonishing sight. The Spartans were not building defenses or preparing weapons. They were exercising, oiling their bodies, and combing their long hair. In Sparta, warriors grew their hair long for battle. Combing it was a ritual of final preparation, a sign that they were ready to die. Xerxes, advised by a Greek traitor in his camp, Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king, finally understood that the Greeks intended to fight. Demaratus had warned him, "These men are the bravest warriors in the world. They will die fighting for this pass." Xerxes dismissed the warning as bravado. On the morning of the 9th day, Xerxes gave the order to attack. He sent the Medes and Scythians, hoping they would easily destroy the Greeks, allowing his own elite forces to march through unimpeded. The first assault. The Medes, carrying short spears and wicker shields, charged forward in a disorganized wave. They ran into the phalanx like water hitting a rock. The Greeks, packed tightly behind the wall, stood firm. The Spartans' long ashwood spears ripped through the thin Persian shields and armor. The pass was too narrow. Persian numbers meant nothing. Every few minutes, Leonidas would order a feigned retreat, a tactical maneuver where the Greeks would briefly step back, drawing the Persians into the wider section, then quickly reform their phalanx and charge back in, catching the exhausted and confused Persians off guard. The Persians were decimated. Their ranks, unable to advance or retreat effectively, were choked with their own dead. Wave after wave broke against the Spartan shield wall. By dusk, Xerxes had lost thousands of men. His elite generals were in shock. The Spartans and their allies had suffered minimal casualties. Leonidas's face, covered in dust and blood, held a grim smile. The hot gates were holding.
The next day, Xerxes was furious. The losses were unacceptable, and his pride had been wounded by these few thousand Greeks. He resolved to crush them with his most formidable troops, the immortals. The immortals were the 10,000 elite soldiers of the Persian Empire, the king's guard. They were always kept at exactly 10,000 men. As soon as one fell, he was immediately replaced, hence the name. They were better equipped, better trained, and carried beautiful golden ornaments. Xerxes sent them forward, confident that their professional discipline would overcome the Greek phalanx. The immortals marched with perfect order toward the pass. Leonidas watched them approach. He knew this was the true test. He commanded his men to hold the line, not to waver. The second assault. The immortals attacked with a fury the Medes had lacked. They used their numbers to try and overwhelm the Greeks, climbing over the bodies of the dead from the previous day. However, the result was the same. The phalanx was unyielding. The sheer force of the Spartans' push, their heavy bronze armor, and their longer spears gave them a crucial advantage in the confined space. The immortals could not get close enough to use their short swords or bows effectively. Again, Leonidas masterfully used the feigned retreat. He would shout an order, the Greeks would break formation and run, and the immortals, thinking they had won, would rush after them. But before the Persian lines could reform, the Greeks would pivot, snap back into their tight phalanx, and smash into the disorganized enemy. The immortals were not immortal here. Hydarnes watched in horror as his best men fell in droves. Their golden armor did not protect them from the bronze spear tips. By the end of the day, the immortals' ranks were shattered, and they were forced to retreat, leaving thousands of their number dead or wounded. Xerxes watched from his throne, utterly demoralized. He had thrown his best soldiers, his most fearsome force, against a mere handful of Greeks, and they had been repelled with heavy losses. His generals whispered that perhaps the pass could not be taken.
Xerxes, the great king, the tamer of the sea, wept with frustration. His entire plan, his entire force was stopped by a few hundred men led by a mad king. The night after the defeat of the immortals, the air in the Greek camp was thick with triumph and fatigue. They had held the line. They had proven that the Persian giant had feet of clay. But Leonidas knew that morale alone would not win the war. He knew Xerxes would not stop. The pass held the key to his victory, but the mountain held the key to his defeat. On the Kallidromo mountain behind Thermopylae, there was a secret path, a narrow, winding goat trail that led over the mountains and emerged behind the Greek positions. This path, known as the Anopeia path, was the great flaw in the defense of Thermopylae. Leonidas had foreseen this. He had deployed the 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain slopes to guard the path. He trusted them to be the eyes and ears on the mountain. That very night, while Xerxes sat in his tent despairing, a man was brought before him. The man was a local resident, a Greek from Milenes, a shepherd named Ephialtes. Ephialtes was short and heavily built, and his face was marred by greed and malice. He offered Xerxes a terrible deal. He would personally guide the Persian army over the Anopeia path for a reward of gold. Xerxes could not believe his luck. His despair turned into jubilant confidence. He promised Ephialtes a king's ransom and immediately summoned his most trusted general, Hydarnes, the commander of the disgraced immortals. Xerxes gave the order, "Take your immortals. Follow this man. Tonight we bypass the walls. Tonight the walls of Sparta fall." Hydarnes, eager to redeem his honor, quickly mustered his forces. The immortals, their spirits reignited by the prospect of a decisive maneuver, began their silent march.
Ephialtes led them under the cover of a dense, moonless night. The path was rough and steep, but the immortals were elite soldiers. Hours later, just before dawn, Hydarnes and the immortals reached the position of the Phocian guards. The Phocians, exhausted from days of vigilance and sleeping lightly, were instantly overwhelmed. They fought bravely, but were quickly scattered by the professional Persian soldiers. The pass was open. The immortals poured over the mountain peak and began their descent. They were now directly behind the 7,000 Greeks, ready to attack from the rear, and sealed the fate of Leonidas.
It was the dawn of the third day of battle. Leonidas was preparing his men for the next wave, expecting Xerxes to throw more troops at the wall. But this time, he sensed a change in the air. The silence from the Persian camp was too heavy. Then, a frantic runner arrived, a Phocian soldier who had escaped the mountain path. His uniform was torn, and his face was streaked with fear and sweat. He fell before Leonidas, gasping out the devastating news. "King, the Persians, they are on the mountain. They have passed the Phocians. They are coming behind us." The Phocians' report was confirmed moments later by other scouts. Betrayal. The flank had been turned. The mighty defense of Thermopylae was now rendered useless. Leonidas convened a final war council. The mood was grim, but the voices were calm. They all knew the meaning of the encirclement. The allied generals argued fiercely. Most of them, the Corinthians, the Phocians, and others, urged an immediate retreat. Their duty was to fight, but not to die unnecessarily. They had already inflicted massive losses and bought crucial time. But for Leonidas, there was no debate. The law of Sparta was absolute: never retreat. And the prophecy was clear: a king of Sparta must die to save Greece. Leonidas gave the order that would define the entire saga: retreat. The majority of the allied forces, the remaining 5,000 men, were ordered to march south immediately and carry the message of the impending Persian victory back to the rest of Greece. Their sacrifice would not be wasted. They were the messengers of hope. But Leonidas himself would stay. He kept with him the 300 Spartans. They had come to die, and they would fulfill their oath. He also kept the 700 Thespians, commanded by Demophilus. These men, knowing their fate, chose to stay and die fighting for freedom alongside the Spartans. Their bravery would be remembered forever. Finally, he kept the 400 Thebans. Leonidas suspected their loyalty and kept them as hostages to ensure they would fight or die in the final stand. The final hour. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows of the fleeing allies, Leonidas addressed his remaining 1,400 men. He stated simply, "Tonight we dine in Hades." His men did not cheer. They sharpened their spears, checked their bronze armor, and prepared for a glorious death. They ate their last meal together, speaking not of fear, but of their homes and their families. The Spartan sacrifice was no longer a military strategy. It was an eternal message. They were dying to ensure that every Greek, from the farmers in the south to the sailors in the Aegean, understood the price of freedom.
The decision to stay was met with a mixture of relief and somber respect by the retreating allies. The Spartans had fulfilled their duty, buying them the time they needed. But the 700 men from Thespiae were different. Thespiae was a small, independent city-state that was not famous for its military might. They had joined the cause out of conviction, not obligation. When Leonidas ordered the retreat, Demophilus, the commander of the Thespians, stepped forward. "King," he said, his voice firm, "we did not come here to fight only when it was convenient. We came to fight for Greece."
Demophilus reminded Leonidas that Thespiae lay directly in the path of the Persian advance. If they retreated now, their city would be the first to fall. Furthermore, they believed in the cause of freedom so profoundly that they chose to stand by the Spartans even unto death. Their choice elevated the entire event from a Spartan legal formality to a pan-Hellenic voluntary sacrifice. The Thespians, unlike the Spartans, had no law compelling them to die. They chose to do so. The Spartan and Thespian bond. The remaining 1,000 free men, 300 Spartans, and 700 Thespians now formed a unique, unbreakable brotherhood. They prepared for the final morning, knowing that their defense could no longer save the pass, but that their collective death would save the idea of Greece. They spent the final moments talking about honor, not fear. Leonidas had a grim duty to perform with the 400 Thebans. He addressed them. "You will remain and fight alongside us. If you fight bravely, you may earn an honorable death. If you betray us, you will be executed where you stand." The Thebans, trapped and unwilling to fight for Sparta, knew they had no choice. They were forced into the final battle. The sun finally rose, illuminating the pass. It was a clear day, perfect for a massacre. Leonidas gave his final speech, a speech that was not recorded for history, but could be felt in the soul of every man present. "The world will never forget this spot. Go forth and meet your destiny. Fight for the legacy you leave behind." With the immortals now descending from the mountain behind them and the main Persian army preparing for the final push from the front, the time for defense was over. The time for the last, glorious attack had arrived.
Leonidas did not wait for the Persians to attack. Waiting meant being crushed between the two forces. He decided to strike first and throw the Persian lines into chaos. He ordered the final line of battle to be drawn up not behind the wall, but ahead of it in the widest part of the pass. This allowed his men more room to maneuver and confuse the enemy. The Spartans and Thespians formed their battle array. Their bronze helmets gleamed. Their red cloaks, which helped disguise blood and prevent fear, fluttered in the morning breeze. The charge. Leonidas raised his sword. It was the signal. With a terrifying, unified roar, the sound of 1,000 men accepting their fate, they charged forward into the dense mass of the Persian army. The Persians, expecting the Greeks to be hiding behind the wall, were taken completely by surprise. The initial impact was devastating. The charge was an eruption of pure, desperate force. The Greek line, moving with the speed and precision of a hunting spear, carved a bloody path into the heart of the Persian ranks. The disciplined ferocity of the Spartans was unmatched. Their objective was not merely to kill, but to reach the enemy's commander, or even Xerxes himself. They wanted to inflict a mortal wound on the Persian morale. The killing ground. The pass became a slaughterhouse. The Greeks fought as one body, their shields overlapping, their spears moving in a synchronized, lethal dance. The Persians were so numerous that they could not swing their weapons without hitting their own men. They fell back, trampling each other, their formation dissolving in panic. The momentum of the Greek attack was so great that they drove the Persians backward several hundred yards past the wall, past the initial lines, right up to the position of Xerxes' own attendants. The king himself leapt up from his throne, terrified, believing the Greeks were unstoppable. His bodyguards quickly formed a protective circle around him. The Spartans and Thespians were now surrounded by mountains of Persian dead, standing in pools of blood. Their bronze shields were battered, their spears bent and broken. But they had achieved their goal. they had terrified the greatest army in the world. They had proven that the spirit of a few free men was more powerful than the endless might of a tyrant.
The furious charge could not be sustained forever. The Spartans and Thespians were surrounded and fighting against endless waves of fresh Persian troops. When their long spears, doru, were shattered, they drew their signature weapon, the xiphos, the short double-edged Spartan sword. The xiphos was designed for brutal close-quarters combat, thrusting into the enemy's soft spots between armor plates. Leonidas was in the thickest of the fight. He was a force of nature, his armor already covered in the blood of his enemies. He was constantly calling orders, rallying his men, and cutting down any Persian who dared to approach him. The Persians focused their entire attack on the king. Killing Leonidas was no longer just a military objective, it was Xerxes' personal obsession. Wave after wave of immortals, Medes, and other elite fighters were sent against the Spartan wedge, tasked with isolating the king. The fall of Leonidas. It happened amidst a massive push. A group of 4 immortals managed to break the line momentarily. Leonidas met them with furious speed, killing 3, but the momentary distraction was enough. From the rear of the Persian ranks, a thick volley of arrows was launched. One of the large, heavy arrows found a gap in Leonidas's bronze cuirass. The king staggered, the life draining quickly from him. He fell to the blood-soaked ground. The Spartans and Thespians witnessed their king's fall, and their battle cry changed from an attack shout to a roar of despair and fury. The battle for the body. The fight immediately shifted. The new objective was simple: do not let the Persians take the king's body. In Greek warfare, claiming the body of a hero was a mark of supreme honor. Surrendering it was the deepest shame. A desperate and vicious battle erupted around Leonidas's body. The Greeks, fighting with the reckless courage of the doomed, formed a tight circle around the king's corpse. The body of Leonidas changed hands 4 times. The Persians wanted to desecrate it. The Spartans were willing to die for it. The entire battlefield now was a maelstrom of death centered on that one spot. The Greeks fought with their broken swords, their hands, their teeth, determined to protect their king's honor.
While the battle raged for the king's body, the situation became hopelessly critical. The immortals, led by Hydarnes, had finally completed their descent from the mountain and were now attacking the Greeks from the rear. The Greeks were completely surrounded. They were forced to split their small force into 2 lines, one facing the main Persian army, which had regrouped, and one facing the immortals' new, fresh attack from the south. It was at this moment of double encirclement that the fate of the 400 Thebans was sealed. The betrayal of the Thebans. The Thebans, who had been kept as hostages, saw their opportunity. Led by their commander, they threw down their arms and rushed toward the Persian lines, raising their hands in surrender. They claimed they had been forced to fight and that their city had always supported the Persians. The Spartans and Thespians could not spare a single man to stop them. They watched with hatred as the Thebans crossed the lines. The Persians accepted the surrender of the Thebans, but branded them as slaves for their cowardice and forced betrayal. The stand of the Thespians. The Thespians, in contrast, fought with even greater fury. Led by Demophilus, they fought shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans. Their vow to die for freedom was now being fulfilled. They did not have the lifelong training of the Spartans, but they had a cause, the protection of their city and the ideal of liberty. They fought until the last man fell, proving that true bravery knows no citizenship. The remaining 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians, now only a few hundred strong, wounded and exhausted, were pushed back toward the narrowest part of the pass and finally forced onto a small, isolated hill. The fighting was reduced to a primal struggle.
Swords were broken, shields were dented beyond use. They fought with rocks, with their fists, and with the spears taken from fallen Persians. The Persians, terrified of approaching the desperate, cornered men, kept their distance. Xerxes, watching the horrific scene, was enraged by the continued resistance. He realized that this was not a battle he could win with skill. It was a scene that needed to be erased.
The last surviving Greeks retreated to a small, low hill at the center of the pass, their final resting place. This hill was their last fortress. They had gathered the bodies of the king and their fallen comrades around them, forming a desperate barricade. They were wounded, covered in dust, and completely spent, yet they stood firm. The Persians dared not come closer. They had witnessed 3 days of unprecedented, inhuman resistance. They saw not men, but demons fighting for a cursed piece of ground. Xerxes, having lost patience and respect, gave the final order. His voice boomed across the pass. "No more of this. Do not approach them. Kill them from a distance." The rain of arrows. The Persian archers, positioned on all sides of the hill, raised their bows. Thousands upon thousands of arrows were nocked. The sky above Thermopylae darkened, just as the local Greek had warned Leonidas. They would block out the sun. A catastrophic storm of arrows descended upon the small hill. It was not a battle, but a mass execution ordered from afar. The Spartans and Thespians lifted their battered shields one last time, an almost futile gesture against the sheer number of projectiles. They stood together, a final, unyielding wall of flesh and bronze. The sound was deafening, thousands of arrows hitting wood, metal, and bodies. They died where they stood, side by side, the Spartans adhering to the law of their city, and the Thespians fulfilling their oath of freedom. They died leaning on each other, united in their purpose, their phalanx unbroken even in death. When the last sound had faded and the last arrow had landed, the hill was silent. Leonidas's prophecy had been fulfilled. He was lost, but he had saved Greece. The Battle of Thermopylae was over.
Xerxes finally descended from his throne. The pass was his. The path to central Greece was open. The sight that greeted him was not one of victory, but of horror. The entire area before the wall was covered in Persian dead. The losses were so tremendous that the king's own generals advised him to cover the bodies with a thin layer of earth to hide the true scale of the casualties from the main army. The king rode his horse to the hill where the last resistance had taken place. He looked down at the lifeless body of Leonidas, which were surrounded by a circle of his finest men. Even in death, the king was protected. Xerxes felt no sense of respectful victory, only a raging, wounded ego. He had been humiliated by a few hundred men for 3 days. In an act of supreme malice and desecration, Xerxes gave a terrible order. He commanded his men to cut off the head of Leonidas and crucify his body. This act was considered an atrocity even by the standards of the time. The Persians generally treated brave opponents with respect. Xerxes' fury, born of his personal humiliation, caused him to commit a deed that was remembered across the world as the act of a tyrant who had lost his reason. The Persian response. Even Hydarnes and the immortals, who had finally secured the victory, were unsettled. They had witnessed unimaginable bravery. They knew they were not looking at defeated men, but at the raw material of legend.
The Persian army would soon enter the heart of Greece, burning Athens and celebrating their apparent victory. But the story of Leonidas would travel faster than the king's army. The crucifixion of the king's body did not destroy his legacy. It cemented it as a symbol of sacrifice against tyranny. The sacrifice at the Hot Gates had been so immense, so absolute, that it united the divided Greek city-states for the first time in history. The seed of vengeance had been planted.
Among the 300 Spartans, only 2 men were recorded to have survived the final battle, both due to circumstances beyond their control. Eurytus had been afflicted by a painful eye infection before the final day. Leonidas had commanded him to return to Sparta to carry news of the impending battle. When Eurytus heard that the Spartans were surrounded and about to make their final stand, he was overwhelmed by shame. He knew the law of Sparta. He was forbidden to retreat. He ordered his slave to guide him back to the pass. Though he was half-blinded and weak, he put on his armor, picked up his spear, and marched back into the chaos. He died in the very last charge, fulfilling his duty and regaining his honor. Aristodemus, like Eurytus, had been sent back due to a severe eye infection. He hesitated, however. The pain was too great, and he chose to continue his retreat to Sparta. When he returned, the story of the 300 heroes was already legend. Aristodemus was not hailed as a survivor. He was branded as Aristodemus the Trembler, a coward. No Spartan would speak to him. No one would share a fire with him, and no one would share a shield with him in the training ground. He lived a life of deep, agonizing shame. His chance for redemption came a year later at the Battle of Plataea, the final clash between the Greeks and the Persians. Aristodemus fought like a madman, charging into the enemy lines without concern for his own life. He killed Persian after Persian, recklessly seeking the death he had avoided at Thermopylae. He died in a glorious act of bravery, at the very forefront of the battle, redeeming his name in the eyes of his countrymen. His heroism at Plataea was recorded, ensuring his place among the Spartan dead, proving that even a moment of fear could be redeemed by the highest sacrifice. The traitor Ephialtes, the shepherd who betrayed the path for gold, found that his reward was not joy, but the deepest condemnation. He was hunted down by the Greeks, who put a massive bounty on his head. He lived the rest of his short life as a pariah, pursued by shame and greed. The memory of the 300 Spartans was built not just on the heroism of the king, but on the painful contrast between the bravery of those who chose to die, the Thespians, the shame of those who lived, Aristodemus, and the infamy of the man who sold them out.
The sacrifice at Thermopylae had bought the Greeks the most critical thing: time. While Xerxes was marching through central Greece, the Athenians, led by the brilliant general Themistocles, enacted the first part of the Delphic prophecy. They evacuated Athens, moving their entire population, women, children, and the elderly, to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese. The Persians marched into a deserted Athens and burned the city to the ground. The great victory Xerxes craved felt empty. The wooden wall the oracle spoke of was the Greek navy. Themistocles knew that the only way to defeat the massive Persian fleet was to lure them into a geographical trap. The trap. Themistocles, using a trusted slave, sent a deceptive message to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greek fleet was about to break up and flee. Xerxes, confident after his land victory and desperate to crush the final Greek resistance, took the bait. He ordered his entire, massive fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis. The Greek ships, triremes, though fewer in number, were fast, maneuverable, and crewed by expert sailors.
The narrow, confined waters of the strait negated the Persian fleet's advantage in numbers and size. The Persian ships became hopelessly congested, unable to turn or maneuver, bumping into each other. The ensuing battle was a complete disaster for the Persians. The Greeks charged forward, ramming the Persian ships with their bronze-tipped bows. The sea turned red with blood. Persian commanders, including one of Xerxes' own brothers, were killed. Xerxes watched the destruction of his navy from his throne high on a cliff overlooking the strait. He was forced to watch his massive, glorious fleet be utterly destroyed by the smaller Greek force. Salamis was the turning point. The sacrifice of Leonidas at Thermopylae had created the conditions for Themistocles' naval victory. Without the delay at the Hot Gates, Athens would not have been evacuated, and the naval strategy would have failed.
After the devastating naval defeat at Salamis, Xerxes, fearing that the Greeks would destroy his bridge across the Hellespont and trap him in Europe, retreated to Asia. He left behind a substantial army of 300,000 men under the command of his general, Mardonius, tasked with completing the conquest of Greece. The final decisive confrontation on land came the following year in 479 BC at the Battle of Plataea. For the first time since the start of the war, the Greek city-states were truly united. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had shamed and motivated the whole of Greece. The unified Greek army, led by the Spartan general Pausanias, Leonidas' nephew, was the largest combined force Greece had ever fielded. Mardonius tried to use his superior cavalry in numbers to break the Greek line, but the Greeks, especially the Spartan contingent, were fighting with the memory of Leonidas driving them. The Spartan phalanx rises again. The Spartans at Plataea were not the old men or the sick, they were the full might of the Spartan army, fighting with cold fury. They formed an unstoppable phalanx. Mardonius' repeated attacks broke against their shield wall. In the final, desperate assault, Mardonius himself, riding a white horse and leading his elite guard, charged directly at the Spartan line. The Spartans, seeing the opportunity, met him with a ferocious countercharge. Mardonius was struck down and killed. The death of the Persian commander instantly broke the Persian morale. The massive army disintegrated, fleeing in a chaotic, disorganized retreat. The Greeks pursued them relentlessly. The Persian camp was looted, and the army was virtually annihilated. Plataea was the final, definitive victory that cemented Greek freedom. It was the revenge for Thermopylae and the end of Xerxes' dream of conquering Europe. The prophecy had been fully realized. Leonidas' death ensured the safety of Sparta and the freedom of Greece.
The sun rose mercilessly over Thermopylae. Leonidas and the remaining 1,400 men, Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans, were no longer defending behind the wall at the pass. The wall was now meaningless due to the Persians approaching from the rear. There was only one thing left to do: attack. Leonidas raised his sword high. The battle cry was not a promise of victory, as in the previous days. It was the last desperate shout for honor. The initial charge was like an avalanche. Breaking their phalanx formation, the Spartans rushed toward the densest point of the Persian army. This was a suicide attack, but a strategic one. Their goal was to shock Xerxes, inflict as many casualties as possible, and ensure that their heroism would carry hope back to Greece. The impact. The front ranks crashed into the Persian wall. Spears pierced armor and tore through flesh. This first assault was so violent that the Persian army retreated in surprise and fear. Leonidas and his men drove into the enemy lines like a wedge. When the spears began to break, the Spartans drew their short swords, the Xephos. This was the moment hand-to-hand combat began. The sword was a more personal, deadlier weapon than the spear. The battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse.
Every Spartan created a circle of death around himself. Leonidas was at the very front of the battle. His golden helmet and purple cloak made him shine like a beacon. He was invincible even in single combat. His sword flashed, and every strike felled a Persian soldier. Then came the moment. A storm of arrows, now raining down not only from the front, but also from the rear. An arrow found a weak spot in Leonidas's armor. The king fell. The Spartans let out a horrific roar. They would not surrender the king's body to the enemy. A battle began unprecedented in history, the struggle for Leonidas's body. 4 times the corpse changed hands. The Spartans and Thespians protected the king's body as if it were a shield. To them, this was not just a body, it was honor itself. Meanwhile, Hydarnes and the immortals descended from the mountain path, emerging behind the pass and completing the encirclement. There was no more retreat, no escape, not even standing still. The Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans were pushed onto a small hill, a narrow area. This hill was the place where history would remember them forever. Their helmets were dented, their armor caked in blood. Their swords were broken. Most were using the swords of their enemies or just their bare hands. The Persians were afraid to approach them. Xerxes gave the order to his soldiers, "Rain arrows down upon them." The sky darkened. Millions of arrows began to pour down onto the small hill. This was not a battle, but an execution. The Spartans and their allies lifted their shields, awaiting that final blow from the heavens.
The battle was over. The Thermopylae Pass was now plunged into a terrifying silence. The dust cloud slowly settled, and the smell of blood and death lingered in the air. The battlefield was unrecognizable. The Persian losses were so immense that Xerxes' general, Hydarnes, did not want the king himself to witness the sight. Yet Xerxes came. Mounted on his horse, he looked upon that small hill. The hill was now a red mound. Countless arrows, like stalks of straw in a haystack, were embedded in the dead bodies. The Spartans, Thespians, and the remaining Thebans had died in their final stand, leaning on each other, a phalanx even in death. Xerxes' eyes searched for the lifeless body of Leonidas. When he found it, his power turned into rage. He desecrated the king's corpse. This was a shameful act, even for a Persian ruler. But his fury had torn away his reason. However, even the Persians were deeply affected by the bravery shown by this small group. They were not looking at a defeated enemy, but at a legend. The survivors and the birth of the legend. Only 2 Spartans survived, Eurytus and Aristodemus. Eurytus had been sent back because of severe injury, but upon hearing the news, he ordered his slave to carry him back to the battle. He died, fighting blindly with his spear. Aristodemus, however, had been sent back due to an eye infection. He survived, but upon returning to Sparta, he was branded a coward. In the next battle, at Plataea, he fought with reckless bravery at the forefront, died, and regained his honor. Thanks to Leonidas's final order, the surviving allies had gone to prepare the rest of Greece. The battle lost at Thermopylae sowed the seeds of Greek victory. This sacrifice united all Greek cities toward a single goal: vengeance and freedom. A year later, the Spartans returned. Their sacred duty was to erect a statue of a lion, Leonidas's name meaning the son of the lion. On the base of the lion, the following couplets written by Simonides were engraved.
"Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." This inscription did not speak of the heroism of the fallen. It merely stated that they had fulfilled their duty, because for the Spartans, heroism meant duty. At night, the wind blows through the Thermopylae Pass. That wind carries neither a Persian war cry nor a Spartan roar. It carries the last breath given for a duty, echoing through the centuries. And it whispers, "Freedom requires the highest price."
The last blood spilled at Thermopylae dried. Leonidas was dead. The 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and other allies were buried under a mound of arrows on a hill. Xerxes had satisfied his pride. The gate had been opened, and the Persian army flooded into central Greece. But there was one thing the Persian king failed to understand. He could tear down a physical wall, but the spirit sacrificed at Thermopylae had created a spiritual wall, rebuilt in the heart of all Greece. The time gained. The sacrifice of the Spartans bought priceless time for the evacuation of Athens and the preparation of the Greek navy. Shortly after passing Thermopylae, the Persian army burned and destroyed Athens, but the city was empty. The true strength of the Greeks lay not on land, but at sea. Later that year in the Straits of Salamis, the spirit of Leonidas was reborn. The Greek navy, under the command of Themistocles, lured the numerically superior Persian ships into the narrow channels and annihilated them. This was the first major blow that broke Xerxes' morale and logistical lifeline. The following year, in 479 BC, the memory of the heroes of Thermopylae turned into vengeance at the Battle of Plataea, where Sparta and Athens finally united their forces. The Greek forces, led by the Spartan general Pausanias, definitively defeated the Persian army. This victory was the final blow that halted the expansion of the Persian Empire into Europe. The meaning of the saga. The 300 Spartans did not die to win the battle. They died for their duty. To them, Thermopylae was not a battlefront, but the law of Sparta. The law forbids retreat. Even the king, even the very last soldier, cannot abandon his post. This sacrifice became the symbol of Greece's spirit of freedom and independence for generations. It was a moment where democracy and free thought stood against tyranny and absolute power. They proved that an idea, not just might, could ultimately prevail. In that final moment, as the Persians' arrows darkened even the sun, Leonidas and his men whispered, "Tyrant, you may pass, but we are dying not to open this path for you, but to show you how one must die in this pass." Epilogue. Even today, when the wind howls through the hot gates of Thermopylae, a sound echoes among the stones. That sound is neither the clang of swords nor the roar of battle. It is the eternal cry of honor, telling the story of the highest price the human soul can pay for freedom. And the statue of the lion forever remembers those 300 who fulfilled their duty, saving an entire civilization through their death.